The Fed meets in Jackson Hole later this week with a much-anticipated speech from Chairman Ben Bernanke. Investors and the markets looking for signals from the Fed chief to boost a slowing economy. So will Bernanke come to the economy's rescue with a new round of quantitative easing? Joining us now is Carl Riccadonna, a senior economist at Deutsche Bank, and Bob McTeer, former Dallas Fed president and a CNBC contributor. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. Bob, let me start with you. What do you expect to hear on Friday?
Well, I don't expect to hear a big announcement about a QE3 or anything like that. I think there will be a statement that traditional monetary policy will continue, normal monetary policy will continue, and that involves open market operations and influence over the growth of money and credit. It's unfortunate, I think, that QE2 was given that label because it led to a lot of misunderstanding about the nature of operations, and I'm sure they'll try to avoid anything that would attract another big label like that.
But Bob, clearly the economy is slowing at this point, whether you look at manufacturing data, the housing data we're getting right now, home sales, the jobs numbers are just not picking up at this point. Is Bernanke going to signal that they are willing to do something, whatever it may be, or is it time to just let the economy heal on its own here, do you think?
Probably both. He'll say we're still on the case, but I don't think he's going to announce any new big emergency measures. Bill, it's ironic what's happened. All during QE2, the Fed kept buying assets, and it created bank reserves and some money, but the banks held on to those reserves as excess reserves. And the money supply only grew about 5% throughout that period. In the last 3 months, the growth of M2 money supply is up to 15%. And so you might say that QE2 is just now beginning to work after it ended. And I think that's a very hopeful sign that banks are finally turning loose of those excess reserves.
I want to get into that more in a moment, but let me ask Carl real quick so we can involve him. What do you think is going to happen on Friday? And do you think the market is setting itself up for disappointment?
I think that to some degree the markets certainly are setting themselves up for disappointment. We have to make it absolutely clear this is not a Fed meeting. They will not be setting policy from Jackson Hole. And there certainly is at least some degree of expectation in the markets that there will be an announcement of QE3. I don't think that will be the case. I think what's more important is that the chairman explain that there are still arrows in the quiver, to continue the metaphor.
Like what, Carl? What could they do beyond quantitative easing? The program we all became familiar with, whether we fully understood it or not, as Bob said. You know, what else could they do to try and prop up this economy here?
Well, there are a number of options, and they could twist into longer duration assets. They could embark on QE3. They could explain different securities that they could be purchasing in QE3. But they also have to make the point that it is not the right time to employ those tools, and they need to see the economy evolve over the next weeks and months to see really what the extent of the loss of economic confidence has been. So it's sort of a gardening approach. The fertilizer is down, the seeds are in the ground, and you have to step back and just see what happens.
I mean, speaking of that, Bob, I want to ask you more about your main point here, that it is finally working now that QE2 is sort of over and banks are finally using their reserves. Why is that now?
Well, I think they got their fill of reserves. People who say that QE2 didn't work forget the counterfactual. If the banks were so nervous that they wanted to hold a lot of excess reserves, had the Fed not provided them, then they certainly would have cut back and things would have been much worse. Just satisfying that need for extra reserves may not have boosted the economy, but it certainly kept it from shrinking more than it did. So I think they finally have enough. And one other arrow in the quiver that I hope they don't use too quickly would be they could reduce the payment on those reserves. It's a 25 basis points now, which sounds like nothing, but in today's world, it's a little bit.
That's a lot. I'd take a little 25 basis points more in my CDs that I'm getting these days. Good to see you both. Carl, thank you. Bob, always good to see you. Thanks for joining us today.